in order to understand why the Obama presidency unfolded differently from the Clinton presidency in this respect, why Obama succeeded where Clinton failed. And a lot of that had to do with things that developed in the years immediately before Obama's election. So I mentioned before that under Clinton, there was no consensus about what to do. There was no agreement among Democrats or between Democrats and reform groups and interest groups of various kinds. Well, what happened in the period 2005, 2006, 2007 was the emergence of a growing consensus about a whole framework for reform. I call it minimally invasive reform. There was a sense that you couldn't disturb the large number of people who had employer-based insurance, many of whom had good insurance, and you couldn't disturb a lot of the major interest groups because if you did, they would succeed in frustrating any reform effort. And so the reform had to be designed so as to deal with the most urgent problems of the uninsured, to set in motion things that could eventually control costs, but you had to sidestep the interest groups and the other public concerns that had become a problem in the previous efforts to reform healthcare. And the key person, I think, who helped crystallize the approach for minimally invasive reform was none other than Mitt Romney. It was the success that Romney had in Massachusetts in passing a program that relied on a health insurance exchange with subsidies for private insurance and an individual mandate, a design that came from the Heritage Foundation, who provided advice to him. And in Act 3, we should have a scene with Romney celebrating the passage of this legislation, flanked by prominent conservatives, saying what a tremendous achievement this was. And although many liberals were not entirely enthusiastic about that approach, the idea was, well, okay, if we could get that through, if we could bring some conservatives on board, if we could get some Republican support, conservative Democrats and so forth, okay, that could be a basis for national reform. And when you look at the proposals by the Democratic candidates in the primaries in 2007 and 2008, Hillary Clinton and John Edwards and Barack Obama, they all had different versions. There were some significant differences, but they were basically following this framework with the creation of health insurance exchanges and subsidies. And, well, if you remember, Hillary Clinton had an individual mandate. But back then, Barack Obama did not. He thought that was a terrible idea during the primaries. One of the reasons that I think 2009, 2010 turned out differently from 1993-94 is that many of the people who were involved in the last few years had been part of the earlier efforts. And they knew how badly that one had ended. They had become both more cautious and more determined. They were willing to make a lot more concessions. Now, I say that many were involved in 1993-94. Of course, there was one person who was not, and that was Barack Obama. He was new to the battle over health care. But the earlier experience, I think, had a big impact on him because he ran into Hillary Clinton on the way to the nomination. He had to debate her 21 times. And from the interviews that I did with people who advised Obama, he didn't actually know a lot about health care or have a great commitment to it before the presidential campaign. I think the campaign had a huge impact on him because of this experience of debating Clinton and because so many of the constituency groups within the Democratic Party put health care on the agenda, required that he address it. And by the end of that campaign, he had become fluent in the language of health policy, and I think he had become much more committed to it than anybody would have had a right to expect beforehand. So we know what a roller coaster 2009, 2010 was. How many times it seemed like healthcare reform was going to go off the rails and careen and become a disaster. But partly because of the commitment of the leadership, because of important changes within the Congress, so that in both the House and the Senate, the top leadership was determined to make this happen, the legislation passed. I have many criticisms of this law, and I could spend a lot of time telling you about all the shortcomings of the legislation. But before mentioning any of the shortcomings, I just want to emphasize what an achievement it was to pass this law, given the long history that preceded it and all of the obstacles that stood in its way. You know, these days, with the use of the filibuster in the Senate, it's almost impossible to do anything in Washington. So it's a miracle that the Democrats, even though they could not get any Republicans on the bill, it's a miracle that they were able to get all 60 when they had 60 in order to pass it in December of 2009.